discuss their design process, tips for finding ways to make a professionally printed game on a budget, and the benefits of trying your hand at game design. So with that, I'll turn it over to the two of you. Caitlyn and Nikolai, take us away.
Thanks so much, Rob. So just to get started, we are presenting this evening on Reconquering Rome, which, as Rob mentioned, was the game that we designed for Sebastian's class last fall. And Nikolai and I are going to give you a little bit of background about us. So like Rob said, I am just finishing my first year at Georgetown. I'm also a cybercorp fellow at Georgetown. And over the last 5 years, I've had various wargaming experiences that have culminated in me not only designing this game, but also serving as Goose president. I'll pass it off to Nikolai so he can introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Nikolai Rice. I'm a second year MA candidate. I only have 1.5 credits to go, and unfortunately tonight that means that I have to sign off at 7 because my thesis class is meeting and we're doing presentations. So this is a very good warm-up for me. But, you know, all props to Caitlyn for being the team lead, so she will carry us through this, I'm sure.
So tonight we're just going to walk through how we intend to structure our talk so that you have an idea of where you might best be able to ask questions. So we're going to start off by discussing our design process, which resulted in us creating an educational war game and an accompanying design journal in the 14-week semester in the fall. And then we'll talk about Reconquering Rome, give you an overview of how the game works, how we sourced and designed the components, and also an overview of what we changed in history to make the game fun. We'll conclude by talking about our impressions from this process and what we perceive to be the benefits of educational game design, and then we'll open to general Q&A. So if at any point you have questions about these specific topics, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll pause as we finish each section so that Rob can ask your questions to us. So Nikolai is going to start us off with our design process in discussing why exactly we chose to focus on the Gothic Wars.
So in the very first week of our class, when the 12 of us first met, Sebastian gave us a list of all of the conflicts that we could choose. The Gothic Wars were one of the conflicts on the list, and Sebastian made it very clear that anyone who did them would get extra credit. So we obviously had no choice. I'm kidding, of course, but basically we chose the Gothic Wars because they happen in ancient history, you know, post the end of the Western Roman Empire, but really pre-Dark Ages, pre-medieval era. So we already knew that we wouldn't have to do any research into future warfare. It also made it much easier to figure out the order of battle because ancient armies are sort of easier to simulate, to amalgamate into pieces that all look alike on a strategic map, which you will see our map later in the presentation. And essentially we only had the Gothic Wars were simply not that they were easy, but that they were certainly doable, more doable than, you know, any conflict in the Baltics or, you know, I give props to the team that chose to do a conflict in Kashmir. But we also chose the Gothic Wars because unlike other ancient conflicts that we knew that there was record of the Gothic Wars, thanks to Procopius. And even if he fudged the facts in a lot of places, we would have a timeline of the entire thing. So we knew what we could aim for in a realistic simulation of the game, so that then we could build rules for the game that could make that as well as other outcomes possible.
So to walk you through how we went about this process, our game design process was largely structured by the syllabus that we had for the course, and 14 weeks is not necessarily a reasonable turnaround for creating a full professional looking box set wargame. So we had our first deliverable due week 3, which was our initial design plan, where we had to say, this is our topic, this is the aspect of the topic that we're choosing to focus on. Do we want to do a tactical, operational, or strategic level game? Do we want to combine those elements? And if so, how do we think we're going to do it? And then that launched us into the research and testing phase, where we play tested other board games that we thought would be useful in sort of coming up with mechanics and a historical basis for modeling our chosen conflict, and also reading Procopius, who, bless him, is incredibly dry, as well as some other secondary source scholars who had tried to kind of give some perspective to the Goths, since there wasn't a lot of written record about them. And that was probably the hardest part, was that research phase, because we were somewhat limited in our sources. So the benefit was, yes, it was ancient warfare. Yes, we had the historical record, but it was very one-sided, because with there being nothing really surviving from the Goths, it was next to impossible to figure out whether or not the Roman record was accurate. And of course, history being written by the victors, it's kind of hard to tell. So then our next big deliverable was our scenario memo, which ended up being, I think, about a 20-page write-up on all of our rules, mechanics, and components to be included, plus a historical timeline of the conflict itself, and then based on that timeline, where we made abstractions for the game and our justifications for doing so. And after that, we moved into a refinement and secondary playtesting phase, where we finalized our map, we ordered our components, and we conducted, as a team, about 30 hours of playtesting on various weekends. And then we had our final presentation and in-class playtest, which essentially served as our final exam on the 13th week of the semester. So each group in the class played each other's games and suggested additional edits before we submitted a final version. So the final version was due during our finals week, week 14. So we got our box back from Sebastian on week 13 with all of our various game components in it. And we had 7 days to say, okay, we're going to adjust our rule set. We're going to change the color scheme for which generals have which counters. And we're going to put everything back in the box and then give it back. And that will be our final exam to be graded. So I'm going to pass it back to Nikolai so that he can go over how we scoped our research.
So as Caitlyn said, there were issues, between not having a Gothic record and having Procopius have a very detailed, if flawed, record. And this, Procopius's record of the war is very day by day, and it can get very dry because it's not his secret history where, Constantine is a ghost that walks the halls of the imperial palace. There is a lot in it that could have made it easier for us to do a tactical war game, because he had orders of battle and he had a lot of different things in his record. But we essentially decided that it would be much more interesting to do a campaign, to do all of Italy, not just, the siege of Rome or the siege of Ravenna. And what made it possible to do that is because as we read through it, we realized that there was a pattern to the ebb and flow of the campaign, that it mattered based on the seasons, but it also mattered based on how many soldiers either Belisarius or his, you could call him an ally, Narses, had under their command, or how the Goths were capable of amassing men in which places to face the Romans, the Byzantines, the Romans. And we realized that there weren't a lot of open battles in the campaign, that when there were, the Goths usually ended up having the advantage simply because they outnumbered the Romans in many cases, because they knew the terrain better, because of course the Goths had already been living in Italy for 2 generations by that point. And we realized that we could also do a lot around sieges, that sieges were basically the beating heart of the campaign. And so we figured out a way to abstract sieges, and we realized that our game would be a lot more interesting if we didn't just have a Roman player besieging one Gothic player. It would be much more interesting if we were able to have a 4-player game with faction dynamics. And so that's where we fudged history probably the most, is that we had 4 players. We had Belisarius and Narses, who were the Byzantine generals, and we had Theodahad and Vitiges, who were the Gothic generals. Theodahad and Vitiges were both Gothic kings. They just did not rule at the same time. One was dead by the time the second came and took control of the Goths. But again, we wanted to have a 4-player game. And basically, we were a 3-player team. So that was quite difficult to play test. So we usually had one person playing both sides of one faction and the 2 others playing sometimes cooperatively, sometimes purposefully combatively, so that we could figure out, what parts of friction could be introduced through relationship and what parts of friction we had to simulate in the game. Basically, the only other thing that we fudged was the Plague of Justinian, which was a really nice scoping to our research because it ended up being sort of the major outside of the player's mechanic that would influence the game, the same way that it influenced later history in the Gothic Wars.
So in looking at this whole process and having discussed how we came up with the game, we also thought it would be important to talk about where we struggled and what the major issues were that we ran into as game designers. So the first kind of goes without saying, the project timeframe was very condensed, and the turnaround we had for our class deliverables required that pretty much every weekend we spent 1 or both days playtesting at my apartment, on campus, and making sure that as we were doing that, we were documenting absolutely everything. So every time we made a change to the rule set, we had detailed handwritten notes that said, okay, these are the things we tested, this is what happened, and then ultimately, it's chicken scratch circling, this is what we decided to go with for our final rule set. And that part was very difficult because we were trying to arrange 3 people's schedules and also try to find other people who would be willing to test the game for us to make sure we weren't creating something that was fun for us and made sense to us, but made sense to no one else. And then second was sourcing the components. So because we were on a condensed time frame, and also because we had never attempted to buy pieces for a full design from scratch wargame before, we weren't really sure how much we were going to end up spending, and we also weren't really sure what the best way to go about it was. And ultimately, we ended up spending about $600 to make all of the playtest copies that we used, and then the final class copy that we submitted for our final grade, and then a little bit under $500 to make the copy that was sponsored by the Security Studies program for them to keep for future SSP students. And what really drove the costs up was actually paying for rush shipping, because we ended up having some of our components professionally printed, but didn't think about international and rush shipping charges. And we bought them in batches because we weren't sure about the quality of these prints. So we didn't want to spend on everything and then say, oh, we just spent $200 and these prints are crap. So once everything was finalized, we ended up spending quite a bit of money on just shipping. And we also didn't have time to use a single manufacturer, although we would recommend going with that if any of you do decide to design your own games. And then, as Nikolai and I have beaten to death, finding source material was a bit of a challenge. Basically, we tried to find some sort of primary source account from the Gothic perspective, and we couldn't find anything. So we ended up really having to overly rely on the Roman account, which meant that as we were designing, we really had to find ways to beef up the Gothic kings, because history was like, yeah, they existed, and they weren't very great. And obviously, from the Gothic perspective, there would be a lot more nuances and internal politicking, and we didn't really get a good sense for that. So a lot of the abstractions that we ended up making are based on the Romans account, which we would have preferred not to have to do. So we'll stop for questions here. Rob, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, certainly. We've got a couple here.
Awesome.
So first, and this is more of a general question, I think, to the class itself, were there issues that came up for groups addressing conflicts that happened in living memory, or at least recent memory, in terms of sensitivity to those affected by the conflict?
Oh, that's a great question. So most of the groups, I think 3 out of 4 of us, did some form of ancient warfare. And that made things much easier on us because we didn't have to worry about the cultural sensitivities surrounding the game. But I do know that the team that focused on Kashmir was very careful to design something that was very high level, avoided stereotyping, and avoided sort of getting into the minutia of different sides of that conflict, in the sense that it was very much a strategic and operational level game. And it wasn't meant to get into those issues that would be sensitive to people potentially who lived through that conflict. But aside from that, at least for this iteration of the course, it wasn't really something that we encountered, largely because most of us took the cop-out of modeling ancient warfare instead of focusing on something more recent, 20th century and onwards.
Yeah, that is one positive, definitely in your guys' case. Not too much living memory of the Gothic Wars. So what game did you play and found to be the most helpful for developing your own game mechanics?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm sure Nikolai also has an opinion on this, but the game that I think did the most for us in terms of giving us a model that we wanted to follow in terms of how fun it was Game of Thrones Risk. I actually showed up. I was the only nerd to show up to office hours like the first week of class. And Sebastian challenged me to Game of Thrones Risk, which I had never seen before. I love Game of Thrones, so I was like, sure, I played Risk as a kid. I can totally do this. And if you haven't played, Game of Thrones Risk has multiple mechanics layered on top of just the Risk, have armies run around the board and beat each other. There's all of these secret objectives and modifying cards. And the game, I lost. I got my butt kicked. I think it was over in like 4 turns. And I was sitting there thinking like, that shouldn't have happened. But the game was so much fun that we played it in class. I ended up buying a copy actually after I lost at office hours because I'm competitive. And I started playing it. And then when we started playtesting games as a team, that was the first game really that we pulled out. Also because it was the only board game I owned at the time. But we ended up modeling a lot of our card decks and our combat mechanics off of the ones that we played in Game of Thrones Risk, because we found that the multi-layered gameplay made for a really interesting game and also would give us the opportunity to model the conflict at the campaign level.
Excellent. So next, what are the decisions the 4 players have to make in the game, and why are they important to the game design?
Nikolai, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. We'll go over a player turn and we'll get into the overview of the game next. But essentially, the 4 decisions that the players make are, for the Romans, the order in which you conquer the Gothic cities, and for the Goths, the way in which you defend the cities that you control, both as a faction and individually. So each player individually controls their own armies and garrisons on the board. And for our game design, we had to make sure that there was a way that players, first of all, could and could not get into one another's way on the map, so that they could frustrate one another, but that, the idea being that it would never be possible to keep your ally from playing, or to keep the other side from playing, unless you've been playing for a few years and you've, completely trounced the other side. But for us, when it came to the decisions that the players made, the important decision that we made, I think, was that we didn't make Belisarius an overpowered figure the way that history paints him. That is not to say that Belisarius was not the greatest of all time. Belisarius was a brilliant general, one of the best generals in history. But we wanted players, when they approached the game, to have to be of Belisarius's caliber in order to win as Belisarius did, and that you could come to the game as a Goth or as a Byzantine Roman and still be able to win the game. So we had to make decisions that allowed for players to move in turn and to make sure that the Romans were not overpowered to achieve the end of the historical conflict that we simulated. Or that we designed the game for, but to make sure that players had a fun time when they were playing against one another, that they were competitive with one another, and that, again, you didn't automatically win because you got to play Belisarius.
So next, were digital versions of the game considered for playtesting?
So I had the bright idea that we were going to try to do this on like Vassal or something to playtest. And then I sat down to actually look at how we would go about doing that. And I realized that I would spend probably triple the amount of time that we had available to playtest, actually getting it to work digitally. And if we had had more time, I think we probably would have gone the digital route, because many trees were harmed in the making of Reconquering Rome, as well as many printer cartridges sacrificed for the map, which when we originally printed it out ended up being about 3 feet by 6 feet of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. So our thinking in general, I think, would be to try to do it digitally if we did it again and we didn't have to do it in 14 weeks. But there was basically no way we could have done it, balanced our other coursework, and actually made the game design as interesting as it ended up being. We would have probably ended up with much more basic mechanics if we had chosen to make it digital. Nikolai, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I do not. Sorry.
All right, and then one final question here for this section. In your game design, were there any historical abstractions, as you put it, that you would have liked to flesh out more, but were prevented in doing so because of potential trade-offs with gameplay simplicity or balance?
Nikolai, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think that we would have liked to have fleshed out the siege mechanics a little bit more, which we have since. The issue is that the sieges historically were resolved in many different ways. They took a different amount of time, and the way that we abstracted it made all cities essentially equal in strength when defending against a siege. And I think the other thing that we would have liked to have fleshed out were the geopolitics of the time. So of course, as you will see, the Goths have a way of winning that has absolutely nothing to do with the game board, with the game map. And we wanted to also include a way to have outside tribes like the Vandals, like the Franks, to influence the game, but we had to put it into event cards simply because you know, a game map is only so big, it gets very cluttered very fast. And event cards are always a great deal to abstract, you know, various different things, both friction-wise and ability-wise.
All right, well, that wraps up this section of questions. Feel free to push on.
All right, awesome. So we're going to go through our game overview of Reconquering Rome now, which will cover sort of a broad scenario overview of the game, how we designed and sourced our components, and then the actual mechanics and rules. So Reconquering Rome, as we've mentioned, is a 4-player game that models the ancient Byzantine Roman campaign to reconquer the Italian peninsula from the Goths. We designed the game so that it's entirely closed adjudication. You can pick up the box and start playing. Each of the turns in the game represents a month in real time. So each year has 12 turns, and the game covers 7 years from 536 AD to 542 AD. So what we found as we were playtesting is that because we were both not yet particularly skilled at our own game, and also we're tweaking the rules as we went along, the game truly can last up to 7 years. But ultimately, once you get good at it, and also if you already have some knowledge of the underlying history, and or you're playing with a Belisarius level of skill, you can finish the game in about 3 years or approximately 2.5 hours. As we'll show you in just a bit, the map features a point-to-point movement system, and as Nikolai has already mentioned, there are multiple ways to win, both as an individual and then as a faction. So all 4 generals are competing against each other for the title of most prestigious general. And then the 2 factions are competing against each other for the Italian peninsula. So Nikolai is going to give an overview of the historical context in which we framed the Reconquering Rome scenario.
Just incredibly quickly, Justinian, great Byzantine emperor that he was, wanted to rebuild the entire Roman Empire of what to him was antiquity. And he basically sends Belisarius to invade Italy in 535. He's delayed. He gets there. He gets to Italy in 536. The Italians basically march up the peninsula, take the Goths out in just a few years. And just as Belisarius is about to take Ravenna, which is the Gothic capital, there's a crisis for the Byzantine Empire in the east with the Persians and their Emperor Horsau invading. And Justinian needs to wrap up the war really quickly, and the Goths are basically almost let off the hook. That is the campaign that we did. There are 2 further stages to the Gothic Wars, which was a Gothic revival that happened after the plague of Justinian in 342. The Goths roll back all of the Byzantines' gains, and then the Byzantines respond with a second invasion of Italy and control Italy, for another couple decades. And basically, where we begin our game is in 536, after Belisarius has already taken Sicily, and after Byzantine forces have reinforced Dalmatia, because we didn't want, we did that as a cop-out because we didn't want the Goths to be able to invade Byzantium from the west. Both Roman generals start across the water and have to invade the Italian peninsula in January of 536.
So as we've mentioned previously, the players represent 2 factions. So you either play as a Roman general or a Gothic king. The Romans have Belisarius and Narses, and the Goths have Theodahad and Vitiges. And again, as we've mentioned, you can either work with your teammate, or you can say, I want to win, and choose to pursue individual victory. So I'll pass it back over to Nikolai for the learning objectives.
So part of our class was that Sebastian wanted us to have learning objectives, so we came up with some. Just kidding. But basically what we wanted to do with this game was to make sure that the players understood how difficult ancient warfare was and what was especially difficult about ancient warfare. We introduced a lot of different kinds of friction into the game. And we wanted to make sure, and this is done through the event cards, through the way that we introduce text into the game with the player sheets that we have, the introductions that we have, how the rules are written. We wanted to make sure that people understood that the Gothic Wars, while we may think of them as a footnote to history, were very important for their time and were actually very important for the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire. We wanted to make sure that players in the end appreciate how much skill it takes to win a war from the south to the north, or from the north to the south on the Italian peninsula. And we wanted to make sure that people understood, after they had finished the game, that a lot of the Roman success depended on how good of a general Belisarius was, but also on how many lucky breaks the Romans had in several of their sieges that lasted a very short amount of time. We're talking wells suddenly going dry. We're talking about walls collapsing because of earthquakes, sort of things. And basically, as we created this game, we just wanted to make sure that people developed the same appreciation that we did in researching this war.
And Nikolai, do you want to also discuss the changes that we made to the historical record for the sake of playability?
Yeah, sure. So as you can see, we made these 5 basic changes, but they all play out in different ways in the mechanics. We wanted to make sure that the game was fun and playable for 4 people. So again, like I said, we included 4 characters when in reality, these characters almost appeared in sequence with one another. And we also took out various Byzantine and Gothic generals from being playable characters or from being controllable characters, simply because we wanted to make sure that the game could have a nice flow. We developed a round-robin system of going so that if you were first in the previous month, you would be second in the next month, and so on and so forth. On the map, we only named Rome and Ravenna, and that's simply because the board got really cluttered when you start naming a whole bunch of Italian cities and can't figure out if you should give them the name that they have from antiquity, the name that the Goths gave them, the name that the Byzantines had for them, or what they're called today. We also included a mechanic for the Plague of Justinian because it is an incredibly important event in that point in history. I'm going to give a pregnant pause so that we can all understand how important pandemics are to geopolitics. And while the plague struck in 542, by the time that the Romans had already conquered the peninsula, had Belisarius not been such a great general, the war could have been going on already. And the plague first arose in Egypt in 537. And so if people had moved differently, if there had been other vectors for the disease at that time, then it could have reached Italy much sooner. Like I said earlier, we also abstracted the Frankish invasion, Vandal uprisings, and also the pro-Byzantine revolt in Mediolanum. And the way that we did that was through event cards. Which means that, of course, they don't happen at a specific time in history, like the Plague of Justinian, but that these events can appear time and again, as the Vandal uprisings did, that they could happen in any Gothic city, not just Mediolanum, which is not named on the board, and that the Frankish invasion could be used by either the Goths or the Romans for their advantage, depending on who's willing to pay them not to attack them. And finally, as I already said, the game starts in 536 instead of 535 because we wanted the Romans to have staging areas across the sea on the board where the Goths could not invade against them. And so we put Belisarius in Sicily and Narses in Dalmatia.
So we'll pause again here for questions before I get into talking about how we designed and sourced our game components. Rob, are there some more questions for us?
Yeah, definitely. So just quickly, there's sort of a formality question about the design of the board. So when the 2 of you mentioned that you only labeled Ravenna and Rome, did you mean that those are the only 2 cities on the board named, or just the only capitals?
So they're the only cities on the board that are named. We have a graphic of our map in this new section, and we'll show you sort of why that is. A lot of it has to do with the underlying graphic that we pulled for the map. There just wasn't enough space to make a reasonable sized game board and also have labels next to the major cities. So we decided that for the game's purposes, Rome and Ravenna would be the 2 win conditions. You have to take them or hold them in order to win. But also then all of the modifiers would be based on those, and the other cities would just be abstracted down.
All right, so next, are you guys planning to expand this game system to include other campaigns at Belisarius' life? Thinking of the Vandal War specifically, but even his later campaign against the Persians could make for an interesting game. Would this be possible, or is this system tuned specifically to the dynamics of the Gothic Wars?
So Nikolai and I have talked a lot about this, and I'm sure he has some points to add as well, but we are intending to eventually, potentially expand it. We wanted actually, continuing to build on Belisarius' life is actually a really great idea. We wanted to continue to expand for different phases of the Gothic Wars and try to keep the same system, but add new card decks, change out the players and things like that. I think, Nikolai, you probably remember better than me what we exactly said we were going to do.
Well, yeah, we had the idea that seeing as the first one, this first phase of the Gothic Wars is a 4-player game, we thought that the Gothic Revival could be a 2-player game. The second stage of the wars, where the Goths retake the Italian peninsula from the Romans, who only have one general on the peninsula, or one autarch on the peninsula. And then we thought that the third phase could actually be a 3-player game, which would be the Byzantines attacking back against the Goths fighting them back, and actually a much larger Frankish invasion that happens towards the middle of the third phase of the wars, being a third player that comes in and possibly splits the Italian peninsula, as the Franks failed to do, but certainly tried.
All right, so next, aside from Game of Thrones Risk, did the team look at other card-driven games, such as the Coin series, Falling Sky, or Pendragon?
So we did want to look at the Coin series. We never really got around to it. We did borrow Commands and Colors Ancients from Sebastian and almost didn't return it to him at the end of the semester. But we looked at the card model in that game because you have to select the card to take your action to move your units on the battle space. And when we were still kicking around the idea of doing tactical versus strategic, we thought that that was a really good way to constrain player action, because we ended up in situations as we were playing that game where we were like, oh, you know, if only I had a card that would let me do X and move, you know, this number of hexes into battle, or if only I had more, you know, hits on my die. And we ended up taking that card idea and trying to incorporate it into some of our card decks, but we didn't actually get to playtest as many games as I think we would have liked to if we had had more time to sort of do that initial research and playtesting phase. I think, Nikolai, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we only met twice in person during that 2-week span, and we played Commands and Colors 3 times, and we played Game of Thrones Risk once, and then everything else basically was us on our own time researching things. We also found a game called Gothic Invasion, which I believe was designed by 2 Greek game designers, and I bought it off eBay from the UK, and we couldn't figure out the rule book. Like, that game was also card driven, and we just, for the life of us, could not figure out how to actually set it up and how to play, like if we were limited to 1 card per turn or multiple cards per turn. And we wanted something that had that mechanism, but we wanted to make sure that it was also something that was easier to understand than some of the games we tried.
So additionally, was there an effort to create an asymmetrical gameplay for the 4 factions?
Nikolai might be able to speak to this better because he really got into the nitty-gritty of which general had which modifiers. So I'll let you take this question, Nikolai.
We did talk about whether we should make it a purposefully asymmetric game, and whether or not we wanted to make it a sort of counterinsurgency style game. But we decided that in the end, just the style of warfare that happened and the objectives that the historical record could tell us that the Goths had were so similar to what the Romans had. Their fighting was so similar. Their methods of organizing were so similar, partly because they imbued the Roman culture that they conquered. That the way that we introduced asymmetry was by giving the generals, like Caitlyn said, different abilities and different special effects when they go into battle or when they're recruiting troops, and so on and so forth, which we can talk about more in the Q&A section or as we go over the rules.
So a few more questions on mechanics and the layout of the board. Were there population bonuses like in Risk?
So there were not population bonuses as such, but we did, we can talk more about our specific recruitment when we get to the turn order, but we did allow for there to be a recruitment bonus if you had recently conquered on the previous turn a town or a city, which will show the differentiation on the game map, because we had different nodes representing different size population areas.
So why did you choose to use so many cities? Was there a criterion for including a city such as size or population?
So we ended up mapping largely based off of an ancient map that gave us Roman roads overlaid over the Italian peninsula. And any city that was at basically a hub of those roads ended up on the map. Also, Nikolai came up with a list of all of the cities that were mentioned specifically by Procopius as the sites of sieges or particular battles. And we ended up including those originally because we were intending to label them so that there was that additional layer to the map. But when we ended up not labeling them, we just decided to keep that system because it worked really well for gameplay.
So similar to that, this particular war did tremendous damage to the infrastructure and population in Italia. Is this taken into account in the gameplay?
Yes and no. We didn't necessarily, and Nikolai might be able to speak to this better than I can because he designed this particular aspect of the rule set. But we tried to make it so that you could only pillage a town or a city that you have conquered once. So like if you take it back, you can't pillage it again. There's nothing left there. And recruitment gets progressively harder. The less land you control, there's also cards that modify where you can move and sort of are meant to simulate famine and destruction and issues in navigating the peninsula.
And one final question on the board design. Do you have a good source for old maps that can be used in a commercial setting?
So we mostly used Google Images, to be perfectly honest. We also used Stanford's Orbis map, which allowed us to put in the amount of time it would take a Roman legion to travel over sea, over land, based on the Roman system of roads that I mentioned. And that really served as the basis for our game map. We originally wanted to take an ancient map and pull the outline and pull the cities and use that as the basis for our game board, but it wound up being a little bit too difficult and also not giving us visually what we wanted for the game. But I know Nikolai did find quite a few good maps, but I think we just used Google Image, Nikolai, right?
Yes.
All right, so that seems to be the last question for this segment, so feel free to continue.
Awesome. So I'll run through now how we designed and sourced our game components. So you can see here our game map. Our map in the box set is printed on a 4-fold game board that's about 30 inches wide by 28 inches high. We designed this map using the GIMP 2.0 free online software. GIMP stands for GNU Image Manipulator Program or something, weird acronym, but very effective program if you don't want to pay for Photoshop or Illustrator. And we actually pulled a screen grab from Total War Attila of the Italian peninsula because you can play through a subset of the Gothic Wars in Total War Attila. And what I ended up doing to make this look less like Total War and more like what we wanted is scrubbing all of the province names, scrubbing the terrain and overlaying new terrain, and adding the point-to-point overlay system as well as any of the text that you see on the board. And when we originally play tested this, we printed it out on taped together 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and we used Sharpie dots as our nodes. The ones we really weren't sure about were in pencil. And I actually still have that folded up map somewhere, but you know, there's X's through things, and we were really using it as a scratch pad to see where we would put the nodes, because the first thing we did was to get the base image and get the terrain where we wanted it, and then everything else was added on through playtesting. And the game map by far was the most design intensive component of Reconquering Rome. I think between playtesting and the amount of time I spent manipulating the image in GIMP It was probably about 150 to 200 hours worth of work between us. And I think it looks really good for only having 14 weeks to do it, but it was certainly a challenge to put together. So this gives you a zoomed in look at how the nodes connect and also where we've chosen to label Rome. Ravenna has the same scroll image and it says Ravenna. So the most important, basically, capital cities for the Romans and the Goths are these red circles with the yellow circle inside of them. The Roman staging areas are red hexagons, and then all the other cities are blue hexagons. And we chose to base the node distance off of the Orbis map from Stanford, as I mentioned, but also the natural topography of Italy. So we figured, okay, they're legionnaires or Gothic farmers who have been pressed into service. They're on foot. They probably only have sandals. So we made the nodes closer together where there were mountains and rivers and hills and just generally difficult terrain. And they're more spaced out over areas that are more flat and or easier to travel. And then we wanted to make sure that we included sea lanes because an important part of how the Romans got there was by sailing, and particularly Belisarius getting from Sicily to the Italian peninsula. But what we found was that if everybody could use the sea lanes, it really got away from the history and overly complicated gameplay. So the sea lanes, which are shown as blue dashed lines, are only available to the Romans in the game. And the full length of a sea lane counts as any unit's full movement per turn. Because what we found from Stanford's data was that it would take about a month to move a relatively small set of legions or cohorts by ship to some area along the Italian peninsula from Sicily or Dalmatia. So if the Romans choose to use the sea lane, they have to use their full movement points for the turn. And something also that I want to point out is the little gray nodes, those are towns. So towns give you some kind of recruitment or gold bonus. And aside from that, they don't factor in at all. The cities are what matter for control and earning prestige as a general. So then we designed, I think we ended up with 6 different distinct card decks. The example here are objective cards. So each faction, being the Romans and the Goths, has their own set of objective cards by year. So there's a Gothic deck for 536 and a Roman deck for 536, and they are based on some set of annual objectives that each side has to complete in order to gain victory points and to be able to win as a faction. Now, they could choose to ignore these and pursue individual victory, which does result in a really interesting game. But what we wanted to try to do with these objective cards was inject the element of, Justinian ruling from Byzantium, telling Belisarius and Narses what to do by scroll decree. And what we did find in the historical record was that the Goths actually ruled by council, and there were multiple competing nobles and perspectives in various areas of the Italian peninsula. So the Gothic council is meant to mirror the pressure that would have been on a Gothic king to sort of maintain control of the population. In addition to these card decks, we also have secret ambition cards for each faction. So each general will draw a secret ambition card at the start of the game, and these will be for their own ability to earn prestige, and they're usually pretty difficult to complete. The idea being that it's great if you get really lucky and you can fulfill a secret ambition, but we didn't want that to be the sole focus of the game because we were trying to also teach the history at the same time. So it's something along the lines of conquer 5 cities without being defeated, or prevent your fellow faction general from conquering Rome first. And once you've completed those, you would turn it over and say, okay, I get X number of prestige for having completed this. And then we also have an event deck that each player draws from every time they take a turn. So there's 52 cards for the Romans and 52 cards for the Goths. And we tried to give them funny names, like Roman Holiday and Under the Tuscan Sun, based on Nikolai's wonderful pun research. And we used those as modifiers for, oh no, bad weather has struck. What are you going to do about it? Oh no, you can't move this turn. What are you going to do about it? And some of them help players and some of them hurt players. And they're also sometimes only taking effect if your faction controls a certain number of cities or controls Rome and or Ravenna. So this picture here is all of the card decks laid out. Our stacking counters for the generals. Each general has a different sigil on top of their stacking counter that represents that stack of armies is general led. And then we ended up improving for our SSP copy the coins. The coins shown here are metal coins ordered from Amazon, but we originally had those plastic party coins that you would put in a kid's treasure chest at a pirate-themed birthday party, which were very flimsy and also very cheap to come by for what was essentially our playtest copy. But the copy that we are leaving in the care of SSP has a custom-made board, custom-made box, custom-made stacking counters, and the card decks that you see, as well as the player sheets, which tell each player what their general modifiers are. So in terms of where we sourced everything, the stacking counters, coins, and dice all came from Amazon. 2-day Prime shipping was the best way to acquire those things, and they also had some really good prices. We had our card decks printed at makeplayingcards.com. If you do this, pro tip is that you can actually condense all of your card decks into one single deck, which will make it much cheaper for you. We originally individually printed all of these card decks separately, but because you can go in and add the text and graphics to each card by hand, it doesn't matter whether or not you're printing the original card deck size or deck size that you intend for that one singular deck. So for example, we printed, I think there's 21 objectives for the Romans and 21 objectives for the Goths. And when I put them into makeplayingcards.com, originally I had them print as 2 separate 21 card decks. But if I printed them as a 42 card deck, we would have saved like $5 and also saved a ton of money on shipping because I ordered all of these card decks separately, which was very dumb because I found out that they were coming from the People's Republic of China and they had to clear customs, and it took a really long time and cost a lot of money. Our game board we had made at boardgamesmaker.com. They were really great. I originally sent them the incorrect image size and resolution, and they got back to me right away and they were like, hey, we can't use this, without charging me the $100 that we were paying to have the board printed. But same issue. Their manufacturer is based in China, so it's kind of hard to figure out when exactly you're going to get something and when it will clear customs depending on where you're based. Particularly for the SSP copy, we ordered our second set of cards and our second game board about 2 weeks after China had initiated their lockdown of Wuhan, and nothing was coming out and nothing was coming in. And we were nervous that we weren't going to hit, originally we were going to have an event at the end of March to play all of the games from the class at Georgetown. And we were nervous that we weren't going to hit that deadline due to shipping constraints. It ended up working out fine because we got booted off campus, but it was touch and go there for a minute. And then the rulebook, player mats, and reference sheets, we had all printed and laminated at FedEx, which was by far the cheapest way we could have gone about it. Really high print quality, and I didn't murder my printer and run my printer out of ink. And so pause here again to take questions on the game components. Rob, are there any questions on this section?
At the moment, we don't have any on the game components. I'll wait just a minute or two if anybody has any specific questions, again, about the game components, the construction of the game, that they want to slide in here really quickly.
We can just go ahead and, because I know Nikolai has to leave soon, I'll let him start talking about the mechanics and rules. And then if we get more questions about that, we'll take them at the end of this section.
Sounds great. Let's do that.
So I actually just saw a question, did we have rules or reference available when playtesting? And I will be incredibly honest about this, that I sort of steamrolled my teammates and wrote out about a 12-page rule set for us before we had a map, before we had agreed on the exact scale of the board game and everything. And that was what we sort of worked from. And it may be selfish to say that I think that that was very useful for us, but I think it was very useful for us because then it was very easy to edit out things that we didn't like. We could very easily say, you know, that mechanic really sucks when we actually play this game, and we should rewrite a totally new one. But we had something to start with. So just going through this very quickly, my thesis advisor has given me until 7:20, so I will still be with you for a little bit. Our victory conditions are different for the two different factions. And essentially the way that the game usually plays out is that a faction must win. And within that faction, there is a general who then wins the entire game. The way that factions win is either the Romans complete 4 successful years of Justinian objectives, objectives that are handed out from on high on a card, and that they must control both Rome and Ravenna in order to win. The Gothic victory conditions are to deny the Romans their objectives and to control at least one of the 2 capitals. Now, individually, the way that a player wins is by gaining the most prestige in reference to their faction mate. And the way that you gain prestige in this game is by winning sieges, by taking cities, and by defeating your opponents in battle. Whether or not you defeat them outright or they retreat, you get prestige. There's more prestige that you gain if you conquer Rome or Ravenna. There are also events that play out where you can gain prestige if you successfully achieve something within that same turn that the event happens, or within that same year that the event happens. And as I alluded to earlier, the Goths have a different way of gaining a faction victory than the Romans, and that is by doing something called joint taxing. You'll see the turn order shortly, but essentially there are months of the year where the Goths tax their population, which is something they did. One of the reasons that people love the Byzantines coming in is because they alleviated all taxes, at least as they were conquering the Italian peninsula. They may ransack your city, but they won't tax you afterwards. And the the Goths give up a lot by doing a joint tax. It means that they can't move their armies. It means that they've put all of their effort into gathering all of this money. But it also means that they are sending money to Persia to get Persia to invade Byzantium. And this is exactly what happened in real life. The Goths were able to convince Horsa that the Byzantines were weak in the east, and that it was a good idea for Persia to invade when it did in 540 or 541. And essentially, as the game goes on, the Goths are pressed to decide whether they want to join tax or whether they want to fight the Romans. Because if the Goths always play together, if neither one of them defects from this choice that affects both of them, because only one of them makes the choice in any one given month, then they can beat the Romans in 3.5 years before the Romans even have a chance, essentially, to get to Ravenna. But that takes a lot of trust and a lot of luck on the side of the Goths when it comes to being in combat. But the Goths can win another way. Simply all they have to do is throw the Romans entirely off of the Italian peninsula anytime after 536, which is saying lightly that it's impossible for them to do that. Next slide. Oh yes, I apologize. We did have a victory condition in our game that we prepared for class that we have taken out since, which was getting enough secret objectives that you are the most prestigious general, that you are automatically, the people want to declare you the king of Italy, which almost happened with Belisarius basically after he took Ravenna. But that takes an incredible amount of not only skill but luck, because there are a lot of secret objectives that require drawing the correct event card in order to be able to obtain that secret objective. So this is our turn taxonomy. This happens 4 times in every month. So essentially what happens is that in every year, there are 48 player turns. Sounds like a lot, but I promise you that after the first 6 or 7 months, people start moving through their turns very quickly because you have momentum in your campaign, and you find that the longer that you think about your moves, the more time there is for the Goths or for the Romans to collude, and the quicker that you are able to move, the more pressure you're able to put on individual players in order to get them to defect from their faction. Basically, you draw a monthly event card, which can range from anything, like we don't have weather in the game per se, but we have weather events, such as hurricanes or droughts or a flood from the Alps. And we have other monthly event cards, as I said, abstracted Frankish invasion, or sometimes Justinian has a lot of money in his coffers and he gives you more money that you can spend. Sometimes there's a shortage of money in Byzantium and you actually have to send gold back. The next thing that happens is taxation, which happens 4 times every year, once every 3 months. For 3 of those months, Vitiges is the one who gets to decide if there's a joint tax or not. One of the months, the Theodahad gets to decide. And basically, you either tax the cities that you control as a Goth, and you get a certain amount of coins based on how many cities you control, or you joint tax. Nobody gets any money. You send it all to the Persians, and then the Goths don't even get to make any strategic moves on the board. They don't get to move armies. They don't get to reinforce their armies. They don't get to buy mercenaries. And then you have a faction action or a faction advantage, which for the Goths is placing an extra cohort, essentially one stacker, somewhere that they control. And for the Romans, it is gold, which they can use to spend either on positive effects from event cards that sometimes pop up, or on purchasing more soldiers to add to their armies. And actually, can you go back to the, Caitlyn? Sorry. Thank you. After your advantage, you get to pick 2 of these, and they must be done in order. You pillage or recruit if you take a city. You either get gold or you're able to get people to fight on your side from that city. You can't pillage them and force them to fight for you, just because there are political considerations, and sometimes that did happen after sieges. Most of the time it did not. You hire mercenaries, which for the Goths are raised anywhere on the board that they control. For the Romans, they have to be staged in Sicily or Dalmatia, which creates friction for the Romans because they have to get their Byzantine forces to the front lines. So as the Romans move along, they capture cities and they have to keep garrisons in them. And they have to reinforce the front army, which is the army that is controlled by the general and the only one that can fight sieges, or that can besiege cities rather. You can move, you move your general stack, which is much larger than any non-general led stacks, because with a general comes all of the logistics trains, et cetera, et cetera. You can choose to move an additional unled army, which is sometimes really valuable for the Romans when they're trying to reinforce the army that's at the front. If you're in a siege, the siege combat mechanics take hold. If you're in defending a siege, there are mechanics that take hold that you can also choose to roll for. You resolve combat, you resolve secret objectives if you have the luck or the skill of attaining them, and then you check prestige. So if you win a battle, you get another prestige counter. If you take a city, you get 2 of them, etc. Okay, next slide. So these are the special mechanics that we had, and I heard that I saw that someone asked what mechanic we were most proud of including in the game. For me, it was the Justinian Plague, because I think that it shows the way that outside effects can have friction, especially on ancient warfare. also because we were able to figure out a way to include it in the game that it becomes more likely the longer you play, but it is not definitive or predictive. It doesn't happen in a specific year, and it could even not happen. You could play the game for a full 7 years. You could take a full 7 years to decide the game, and the plague doesn't strike. That's being very lucky. But essentially, the special mechanics that we have are faction objective cards. You know, the two factions have different objectives that they have to achieve. They are similar in how difficult they are to achieve, but they are also different in the ways that you can achieve them. Because again, the Goths can tax for money. The Romans can only get more money essentially either by waiting for a trickle from Rome or by conquering cities and pillaging them. Our monthly event cards are a lot of fun. I think that the pun names are great. And I think people really appreciated them while they were playing because it's a relief for you. It's a small joke that you get, you know, while you're trying to decide whether or not you're going to storm the gates of Rome. Again, we have secret ambitions. We have the prestige, and prestige we tweaked a lot. That was the one that we had to work over and over and over to figure out how we could balance the game well so that one player didn't run away with all of the successes in the game. It's possible for a player to run away, again, if they are the skill of Belisarius. But we made it so that the player who plays Belisarius does not automatically get all of the opportunities and the prestige. Our Persian distraction, I think we tweaked that quite a lot too. We wanted to make sure that the Goths could achieve the Persian distraction so long as they worked together. Even if they lost territory over time, which is what happened, they could still work to get enough tribute to send to Persia to get Persia to invade the Byzantines. But it requires quite a lot of collusion on the Gothic players, and never in our playtesting have the players colluded unless it was one of the three of us playing as the Gothic side. Okay, next slide. So like I said, the Justinian plague mechanic essentially is something that every player influences at the start of every year after 537. One side will roll a die and the other side will roll a die. And if they achieve a certain die roll based on our beautiful calendar that we have that comes with the game, then the plague strikes. And essentially what happens is that a lot of people die. The generals' armies, which will be the largest stacks on the game, will have all the garrisons are reduced essentially to their minimum size. Unled armies in the field basically die out and have very little effect on the game. Players don't either get money from Rome or to raise armies, and it becomes much more expensive to hire mercenaries. And basically this creates so much friction that when the plague strikes, it can entirely collapse the momentum of the game. And it hurts more for the players doing better because it creates almost an even playing field for both sides. And if the Romans are charging up the peninsula and the plague strikes in 538, then the Goths are really are back in the advantage because they are capable of stumping Roman forward progression and creating barriers on the map and being able to slowly move forward. All right, next slide, please. And basically, as we play tested, we learned that, as I alluded to before, that we needed to balance the skills of all four generals so that not just one general like Belisarius had all of the advantages, that you would have to have the skill of Belisarius coming into the game in order to win as quickly in history as Belisarius did. And that means that you can finish the game in about 2 to 2.5 hours is probably the quickest that you could do it. I mean, the longest that it could go, if you go 7 years, which means that you're taking forever between turns, you're not colluding with your faction mates. I guess the game could go on to 4 or 5 hours, but we never had, after the game was finished, after we had rules, a playtest never took us that long. And we purposefully made the factions fractious so that you have to collude if you want to win quickly. You cannot win at this game alone. You'd have to be incredibly lucky. It would take more than the skill of Belisarius to win this alone, because again, Belisarius did not win alone. He had to deal with Narses, and he had to deal with other Byzantine generals and cajoling them and making sure that they were working with him in this. Finally, we learned that the stacks that we had, we were very glad that we got essentially kindergarten counters that are difficult to fall over and stick together even when they do. And we went with the representation of armies in the field in a certain size, instead of like Frederick, where you can write down the size of your army on a sheet and other players don't know how large your army is. We decided to go with the counters, with stacks on the map, just because, first of all, we thought it looked much better. Second of all, it was easier for players to gauge how well their campaign was going. And third, because it's very impressive to see how big of a military you can attain on the map. And it makes it just a lot more fun to be able to say, this is how many of your units I deleted in this combat phase and in that combat phase. And it's much more tactile, and players, or at least we enjoyed it more, and the players that we play tested with seemed to enjoy it a lot. Next slide. I think this is actually where Caitlyn takes over.
It is where I take back over, and I apologize for clicking back and forth. My mouse is not cooperating with me this evening. Rob, were there questions for us just before Nikolai has to pop out about the mechanics?
Yep, I was just about to say, let's squeeze in a few questions before he has to hit the road. So first is one back to game design, the board itself. Did you initially decide to make it node-based because of the focus on roads as lanes of movement, or was an area-based design considered?
So that's a great question. We did originally kick around, because the map that we pulled from Total War had provinces, the idea that maybe areas and zones of control would be a better way to make the map in terms of movement and playability and sort of the visual aspects. But when we really got into doing the research, what we found is that, especially under the Goths, they were just kind of using the Roman system of, provinces and cities, and it wasn't as defined as we'd originally thought it was. And so at that point, we decided that roads probably made the most sense, because if soldiers are on foot, then it's harder to kind of grasp the concept of, oh yeah, they're just kind of running through this random field and forest in this province, and you have to abstract how they get there. With the roads being the underpinning of the node system, I think, at least what we found in playtesting and what some of the folks that we have run the game for have said, is that it's easier to visualize sort of how you could move on the peninsula. Whereas if we had gone with an area-based system, I don't necessarily think we would have successfully captured that aspect. We would have had to put a lot more time and effort into the design.
And we had a few questions about time limits and maximum and minimum time to play the game, but Nikolai, I believe you sufficiently addressed those. So next, for game mechanics, did you consider ways to integrate the fog of war in a strictly military sense, at least insofar as hiding troop movements or army composition from other players?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we considered doing what Frederick does, which is having military sizes on a separate player sheet. But we found that to be very tedious, especially because we have combat phases in which soldiers are deleted in combat, and it just made it a lot easier to have all of the pieces on the board. As we play tested, and when we play tested with folks in the class, they actually really appreciated the ability not just to see your opponent, which yes, that sort of very much violates the fog of war, but they really appreciated being able to see where all of their units were. And while Belisarius, of course, as all ancient generals, had the problem of knowing where his infantry was and where his cavalry was, just for the playability of the game, we decided that it would be much easier and much quicker, much more simple and easier to jump into the game and be able to play the game from the rules if we eliminated that level of the fog of war, which we talked about and was why we introduced so many more sources of friction to slow down the movement of units on the board, or to slow the progress of a campaign on the board, because we had to eliminate the fog of war because of how easy we wanted the game to be playable.
All right, so first I think it's worth mentioning that someone in the chat just mentioned that my wife and I had a gerbil we named Belisarius, so that's obviously important to note. And then secondly, one big overarching question that I want both of you guys to address, particularly Nikolai, before you go, is what lesson did you learn from designing and playing this game that you think would be most applicable to practitioners of modern warfare?
That's a really good question. I am not a practitioner of modern warfare. I will admit that I probably don't know as many practitioners of modern warfare as other people know. But as far as this game goes, I think that what we modeled really well by introducing so much friction between players was showing how difficult it is in the end to have to fight in a coalition. How much you really want to be able to control, as Belisarius, to tell Narses to go north instead of looting the cities that are really easily accessible to him in the south. How much you want to tell your Gothic teammate, do the joint tax, don't be greedy. If we do the joint tax, we can achieve our strategic objective that has been set out for us, that we agreed to earlier. You know, it may look like we're losing now, but there is a way that we can find a geopolitical solution to our strategic problem. That's not to say that there are always such options in modern warfare. Very often there are not, especially because modern warfare can happen at a much faster pace. But in long campaigns like this, where you have to have a large number of people in the field, just how unruly controlling so many people can be as a person at the top, and how you are limited in the orders that you can give. I think that is not a lesson that we can necessarily teach to practitioners of war, because of course I hope that they already know it, but to reinforce that this is a problem that has existed since time immemorial. And with that, I'm afraid that I really do have to run to my thesis class where I'm also presenting tonight. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has logged in. My email is at the end of this presentation, and I know that it'll be on the Goose website in the share drive that we have. So please feel free to email me with any questions that you have, with any suggestions that you have, because of course we are continuing to develop this game at as slow pace as we are right now. And I really, really hope that someday we can play this game with you guys, and that we can play games that other people have designed, because out of everything that I have gotten out of this class, the most important thing and the most valuable thing are the networking, the connections, the simple amount of fun, and things that I have learned from everyone who builds games and who shares them with the community. So thank you guys very much. Caitlyn, I hand it off to you, fearless team leader.
All right, thanks, Nikolai. Good luck with your presentation tonight. So just to echo what Nikolai said about the lessons learned for practitioners of modern warfare, I do think that what we did model particularly well is the difficulty of coalition building and coalition maintenance. But I think the other thing that at least I personally learned through this process is that not only has warfare not changed that much in terms of the things that you have to think about, from logistics to politics back home to making sure that morale is high and that you have skilled generals, but that there are so many other things that underpin warfare beyond just the tactical and operational execution day to day. And something that I think we modeled especially well in that sense was the competing tensions from Byzantium and the Gothic nation writ large, and the pressures that placed on players to come up with decisions and in some cases tactics that would enable them to appease the folks back home or appease their leaders without actually getting any closer to winning. And I think that that's something that is true in warfare in a lot of cases is you, as the warfighter or as the practitioner, can end up being hamstrung by somebody who doesn't necessarily know what you're experiencing on the ground. And I think that was really my biggest takeaway was, we played, each of us on the team, as, Goths, Romans. We took turns. We kicked around the idea of being the Franks or the Persians. And regardless of which faction we played as and which modifiers we had, that was something that we found to be universally true. Are there any other questions before I keep going, Rob?
Yeah, we got a few more here that I think
Cool.
worth addressing. So on mechanics, were there any, or what was the most challenging thing to remove from the game? Why did it have to go, and why was it difficult to remove?
So the most challenging thing to remove from the game was freedom of movement. So we originally had a lot fewer constraints on how far you could go, where you could go, how many armies you could take, how many armies you could leave behind. And what we ended up having to take out, even though it was fun, I should say it was fun if you were the one doing it. It was not fun if you were on the receiving end, was leaving one single cohort stacking counter behind you on a node as you sort of went back to whatever your defensible position was. So for example, in one of our play tests, we left, as the Goths, 6 different cohorts, each one on a node, on a path to the next city that the Romans had to take, which meant that the Romans had to battle on each individual node, which wasted a Roman turn per battle. And that was only also if they were successful. So you could end up wasting double or triple that number of turns on fighting these single Gothic cohorts in open combat. And when we first figured out that that was a strategy you could employ in playtesting, we were like, oh, haha, like this is the trump card. If somebody figures out how to do this, then they can prevent the other player from getting to a certain spot or taking a city, and so on. And the more we play tested it, especially since we all knew the trick at that point, the more we realized that as soon as you figured that out, the iterability of the game was gone. Basically, once you got to that level of skill or you figured out that one strategy, that was it. It was game over for anybody else you were playing with who hadn't figured it out yet. So as fun as it was to have realized that strategy for ourselves, to have put it into practice, and also as annoying it is to really have to think about how many nodes you can move, and then you get stuck because of a monthly event card and everything, and then you realize you haven't moved in 3 turns. Taking that out was probably the most important thing we could have done for game flow and combat, even though it allowed for a little bit less creativity and a little bit less flexibility in movement.
So was there any media that helped inform the development of the game that wasn't a board game, specifically for things like tone? So movies, TV shows, etc.?
Yeah, so I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know it's in the design journal. And if somebody wants it specifically, feel free to email me or Nikolai after this. There's a really great podcast that goes through the entire history of Byzantium from start to finish. So you can listen to the sections just on the Gothic Wars if that's what you're interested in. The Rome series on Netflix, we had all watched, I think by the time we got around to designing this. A lot of the puns on the cards are various movies that are in some way related to Italy. We also found, unclear how true to history and or linguistics this is, but there's an online Gothic dictionary that has very few words in it because very few words, I guess, survive of the Gothic language. But we used that to do some research and to put names on cards. YouTube channels, Kings and Generals, we watched a bunch of their videos. If you type in Gothic Wars into YouTube, there's a ton of really interesting videos, and a lot of them add in that aspect of humor of like, oh, haha, Belisarius was so great and Narcissus was so lame. And we wanted to make sure that that aspect was in there because otherwise history can be a little dry if you're just being asked to memorize these ridiculously long names and remember why somebody's important. But we wanted to make sure that based on everything that we had watched and read by that point, that we were giving the players a character that they could step into. And we hope that that is what people can take away from the game, is feeling as though they really did play as a Roman or as a Goth or, as Belisarius.
And could you elaborate a little more on the designer journal?
Sure. So the designer journal was meant to be a summation of our entire design process, all of the sources we used, the actual history that we based the game on, all of our justifications for our mechanics, and any notes that we had from playtesting. So the idea was that after this course, if we wanted to continue to work on the game or do anything with the design, we wouldn't have to go back through piles upon piles of notes and file folders and figure out where we placed things. It would all be condensed into one document. And this also served as part of our final exam. So if I remember correctly, our designer journal was about 15 pages single spaced. And I actually have a notebook that I kept that has all of my handwritten notes in it from the design process to accompany it. And if I recall correctly, it also had like a 5-page bibliography of all of our sources so that we knew where we got things, we knew where we had sourced everything. And it was basically meant to serve as an organizing final product so that if we picked this game back up 3 years from now, we would at least have some sense of what we had been thinking at the time. And I actually think that was one of the most valuable takeaways from the course, is that at the time we were kind of resentful because we were like, we just spent all this money and we just built this game, and now we also have to write this like 20-page paper as a final exam and tweak the game to make sure that it's where we want it. And by far, that was the most valuable deliverable we had for the class, in terms of forcing us to think about what we had done and what we had learned, and also setting us up to then continue to build on the game.
So would it be accurate to define the level of the game as political strategic rather than strategic operational? Are there any details at the operational and tactical levels?
So it would be accurate to describe it as political strategic in the sense that players can choose to focus on that aspect. So what we wanted to try to do was make it so that if warfare is not your thing, if you're a bad dice roller, there were still elements of the game that would be interesting to you as someone with an interest in history or a background in political science, or just in general, you know, an interest in the dichotomy between the political and the strategic and the military operational. We have a lot more details at the operational level in terms of how you go about moving between cities and conducting your campaigns. Tactics mostly got shuffled out. There's some tactical advantages that are given through generals' individual modifiers. So for example, Belisarius is really, really good at sieges. That we wanted to kind of keep his skill and luck as the greatest general in that sense. And so he can roll for a siege opportunity, I think 4 turns before the other generals. So his dice probability is much higher for a successful siege opportunity, which is meant to sort of simulate him being tactically superior at conducting sieges. The Goths are tactically superior in open field combat because they know the terrain. But in terms of making actual tactical decisions and sort of moving pieces at that level, we ended up abstracting those out because it didn't make sense with the way we had designed the game board. And by the time we found games that we had played that we liked that had that element, we were so far along in the design process that it didn't make sense to go back to square one to sort of override what we had already done.
So related to your mention about the combat modifiers, could you elaborate a bit more on how the combat resolution works as a whole? Is it straight up risk, or are generals or other modifiers / cards used to impact the results?
So it functions largely like risk. The idea being that we wanted a combat system that most people could pick up and be familiar with. So the attacker rolls 3 dice. The plurals always get me. And the defender would roll up to 2. And then you match them, and the highest wins, and then you delete whoever lost 1 cohort per lost pair. But where we really started getting away from just the risk combat rolling was in our siege rolls and in the general modifiers. And there's also some card modifiers as well. So you can draw a card that says add +1 to all of your attack dice this turn. And that means that if you roll a 6, then you have a 7 and nobody can beat you unless they also have a modifier. So depending on what cards you draw, you can get +1, -1. And then with the sieges, what we wanted to model for siege combat was making it different from open combat in other forms, but also ensuring that we modeled the luck aspect of successful sieges. The majority of the Roman sieges were not necessarily won by skill, but because the Romans got lucky. And so the general who is conducting a siege has to roll for a siege opportunity before they can begin combat. So on average, it takes, I believe, 2.5 turns for a general other than Belisarius to successfully create the opportunity. And once the opportunity has been created, then the defending player can roll a single die. And if they roll higher than what the attacker rolled, the siege opportunity is lost. So it allows for a bit of a battle back in that sense, where just because you create a siege opportunity doesn't mean that the defender is going to be engaged in siege combat that turn. And the opposite is also true. So we do have, I believe, Gothic modifiers. I believe they get +1 on town nodes, so the little gray circles. If they're on a town node and the Romans come to attack them, they get +1 as a modifier. And the other modifiers for the generals are based on generating gold and recruitment, because we weren't sure how to keep Belisarius's skill level in tactics and operations without coming up with some other balance. And we didn't want to make these generals that history has not spoken particularly highly of super powered to match Belisarius. We really wanted to keep Belisarius as kind of an island unto himself in that regard. But if there's more specific questions about exact modifiers, I can get more into that.
And then one final question on game mechanics. Do you think playtesting with a team, as in everyone working on the game together, versus alone made a huge difference, or more issues in collaboration? So more in your guys' actual creation of the game.
So I will say that I think personally, and I believe Nikolai would agree with me as well, that playing as a team allowed us to find areas of the game that made sense to one of us that didn't make sense to the rest of us. And that helped us design something in a short time frame that was actually playable and replicable. If we hadn't play tested as a group, as much as like there was the friction of, hey, you know, it's taking you 25 minutes to decide where you want to put this cohort, and, you know, we need to eat. And also, you know, kind of aggravation around, well, I designed this really awesome mechanic and now you two say it doesn't work. We ended up with a lot of rich mechanics that we wouldn't have had otherwise, because if we had play tested individually, I think there would have been a little bit of confirmation bias of like, oh, of course this makes sense. Of course, you know, this is how movement should work, and this is exactly how many nodes you should be able to travel. But I will also say that solo playtesting has its merits as well, where, you know, if you're designing the game by yourself, you know the game best, especially if you're trying to create a solo game. There really is no better way to design that than single-handedly. But I will say that for our process and for the purposes of the course, being in a team setting definitely made the world of difference in terms of enabling us to meet the deadlines and to come up with something that we felt accurately modeled history and also incorporated a lot of what we learned in our master's program about the different aspects of warfare and how they impact campaigns.
All right, so we have a few questions that are more kind of overarching, big picture, and figured we'd save those for the very end. So go ahead and continue.
Cool. So I'm going to get on my soapbox now and talk about the benefits of educational game design and sort of what we took away from this process. So in general, we came up with this list of benefits to having done this in a team setting. So the three of us that designed this game ended up with a portfolio of wargaming work for career and publication purposes. So if we decide to publish Reconquering Rome, we have, essentially a playtest copy that we could submit to a publisher. And if we choose to pursue wargaming as a career, we also have some background in game design and an actual product that we could talk about in an interview. In general, not just specific to the Gothic Wars, going through this process definitely improves your knowledge about an aspect of history and whatever conflict you choose to focus on. I knew about the Gothic Wars only in a very limited sense, and largely from the Roman perspective before we went through this process. And I had no idea that the Goths were as politically diverse and rich a society as we discovered through the research process. And it also helps you to determine what factors matter sort of in the arc of history and which ones don't. For example, this entire war, this entire set of wars could have been entirely different if Belisarius had never existed, or if Justinian were in some ways a better emperor or less controlling, if the Persians hadn't invaded Byzantium, if Belisarius had chosen to accept being crowned king of Italy. And I guess one of the biggest takeaways for our team was being able to have an informed opinion about the conflict and to be able to speak with authority about what we had modeled. In the context of the course, it also gave us a number of networking opportunities. Sebastian set up for us a trip down to the Krulak Center at the Marine Corps University at Quantico to run the game for Marine Corps officers with our classmates who also brought their games. Nikolai wanted me to especially highlight the project management and teamwork skills. Not that you couldn't get these in some other fashion, but particularly designing a war game with all of its various moving parts and written deliverables in a condensed time frame with two people that you did not know at all before you walked into the class was a crash course in setting realistic goals, working with other people, and our team got along really well, for which we were very fortunate. But that was one of Nikolai's primary takeaways that he wanted me to highlight. And finally, what we hadn't thought too much about before going through this process was what actually makes games enjoyable and what do players enjoy about the games that they love. And as we play tested ourselves and as we play tested for our classmates, we came to an understanding of what sort of decisions people like to make when they're playing a game and what sort of decisions they don't enjoy making. For example, people really enjoyed deciding which city to besiege and how to spend their gold. But what they really hated doing was figuring out if they were going to collaborate or not, because early on you're like, oh, haha, I can win by myself. And as time goes on, you realize that's not the case. But with all of those different competing aspects in Reconquering Rome, we found that some people really enjoy making certain game decisions about combat, and other people really hate combat and would rather just collaborate to get the Persians to distract the Romans. It also showed us the differences in gameplay between decision making and micromanagement. So a lot of what we eliminated through playtesting was, spending a ton of time writing down exactly what your army strength was and what your modifiers were, and keeping track of a bunch of cards and modifications based on those. Because what we found for, an entry-level game, which is what we were intending this to be, is that can be really daunting and can be kind of a turnoff to people who are new to gaming. For those of us that are really into gaming, that's really enjoyable. You can spend an entire weekend or longer on a game with friends that has those elements. But for a starter educational game, we wanted to make sure that we were creating something that was accessible for people who were coming in with no gaming knowledge, no historical knowledge, and potentially even no military or political knowledge. So I think that distinction was something that this process taught us a lot about. And then we would be remiss if we did not highlight our takeaways from the course itself. If there are any Georgetown students who are interested in taking this course in the future, it is by far one of the best courses that I have had thus far. The benefit is you get an actual product at the end in a structured fashion in a formal course. So we were learning from Sebastian, who had a wealth of experience to draw on, and we were building the game as we were learning wargaming. So we were able to directly apply the concepts that we were learning about from reading books and articles to our game design process. Sebastian also generously allowed our class to play through his own game collection, and even went so far as to curate games, a list of games for us specifically based on our topic. So each team kind of had one or two things to go look at or borrow from Sebastian or buy to influence their game design. And again, something that Nikolai really wanted me to highlight was the value of workshopping games with what is essentially a captive audience. Because you're testing your peers' games and they're testing yours, you learn what makes sense to other people who have a far less detailed understanding of your historical conflict. And you learn a lot about how to adjust the design for the player experience. We also were able to gain experience as game moderators when we ran the game for the officers down at the Krulak Center, as well as our classmates, which obviously, if Reconquering Rome is ever commercially available, it will just be a box that somebody opens. But it was really fun to be able to get to walk through the game with somebody who's sort of seeing it for the first time. And then we wanted to highlight our most memorable moments from the course. Sebastian gave us a number of tactical decision games, and for the most part, on the whole, we were terrible at them. Nikolai wanted me to mention that he learned not to commit war crimes by using civilians as human shields. And there were numerous occasions where I completely failed to interpret the NATO symbols on the map and sent my Marines directly into enemy territory. But they were a really valuable learning experience, especially for the civilians in the course. And the decision constraint and time constraint that TDGs place on us as students who are sort of experiencing them for the first time without necessarily having the background in the actual practice of warfare was indescribable. We were really uncomfortable as a class, I think, at the outset, but we got better at them as time went on, and a lot of the decisions that we were forced to make in those games influenced how we felt we could constrain our players in our own games. And then my personal favorite aspects of the course were the in-class and Krulak Center game tests. We knew that we designed the game well when the players who were playing as Belisarius took Rome in the exact same month that Belisarius took Rome in history. And it was also really fulfilling to see other people enjoy the game, especially people who didn't have to pretend that they liked us or liked the game. It's one thing to play with your classmates and everybody's, trying to be nice and give a good review. But it was another thing entirely to see folks down at the Krulak Center actually enjoying the game and asking questions of us. So I will pause here on this slide. So if you want to jot down our emails, you can. These slides will also be available in the Goose Drive of resources. Absolutely feel free to reach out to us if you have any suggestions, further questions, if you want to follow up about resources that we used. We didn't drop our entire bibliography from our design journal into this slide deck because we were intending for it to be informal and we didn't want to overwhelm anybody with links. But if you are looking for specific details about anything that we read, watched, used in our design, please feel free to reach out to us. And at that point, I will take any remaining questions.
Yeah, we've got a few left here.
Awesome.
So first, any advice in helping students learn how to make such games when they haven't played any before?
That's a great question. I had been, I'll speak from my own experience. I had been sort of out of the hobby gaming realm for probably about 4 years by the time I registered for this course. And I was kind of intimidated, to be honest, by everybody else's seeming extensive knowledge of every great game that's ever existed, and they have like this internal library of games to draw from to say like, oh, what about this mechanic? And or they're digital gamers and they know everything there is to know about digital games. And actually through this course I got back into digital gaming, and I've been having a ton of fun playing Stellaris and Civ and all of the things that I downloaded ages ago and forgot about. And my advice would be to pick a topic or a conflict that you're particularly interested in and buy a game on that, or play a game that's not really intended to be on a specific conflict. Like Game of Thrones Risk, I will joke, is sort of the gateway drug for a lot of people in our class, because we all got so competitive about it that we wanted to learn more, we wanted to play more. Another great game that really got us fired up was Rising Sun. I wasn't particularly good at it from a strategic perspective, but I knew that all I cared about was getting like the blue river dragon piece. And that's, I think what's really important about getting your start in gaming is finding games that you like and then building off of that, because you don't have to know, and this is what I wish someone had told me before I took the course, you don't have to know every game that's in existence. You don't have to have played every game that's in existence, but knowing games that you like and having a set of mechanics that you like is probably the best way to get started.
All right, so next, are you guys planning to kickstart or otherwise go public with this game? And related to that as well, what is the state of the rights to the games that are developed as part of this class? And Sebastian can also, I'm sure, chime in on that as well.
Sure. So we are trying to find potentially a publisher who would be interested in publishing Reconquering Rome. If we ultimately don't find an established publisher, we will consider either putting it up on Kickstarter or making it for educational use so that anybody who's interested in accessing it can access it. But at this point in time, we don't have anything super concrete nailed down in those areas, although that is something we're interested in, because the whole point of designing an educational game from our perspective is to make sure that it gets out to people. Something that Sebastian and I have discovered since the course was run is that because we paid for the original design of the game and all of its components, even though SSP funded a second copy, Georgetown's hoity-toity lawyers have informed us that we own the rights to the game itself. Sebastian was successful in securing funding for the next set of students who will have access to a small pot of money from which to fund their components for the course that's running in the fall. And I believe that will make it somewhat different with the intellectual property because the university is paying for the game design. But as of right now, for Reconquering Rome, we own it. It is ours.
This is Sebastian. I want to quickly inject on this one point. So as Caitlyn said, one of the purposes of the course was to allow the students to have their own intellectual property and copyright to the games that they created. However, legally, if the students do take funding from the program, the program itself will own it. So the students have to make a decision early on if they want to take the expedient short-term gain of getting the funding and reducing some of their costs in terms of the course, because understandably you don't want to put financial burden on the students, because that's also something I learned running this class for the first time about how difficult it is in terms of both the time aspect, both of the financial aspect for the students, especially for those who are working. But that is how the setup is designed right now. The students will own all their games and the game materials coming out of the course if they don't take any funding from the program.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. Next, do you play test games for designers or to other design groups, or I guess, do you intend to?
At some point, that's something that I personally would like to get into, and I know Nikolai would as well. Currently, we don't. We only really help to play test our classmates' games, but I'm certainly interested, as is he, in play testing for designers or design groups in the future. We just haven't had the time to connect to anybody to sort of figure out if there's an opportunity for us to assist there.
All right, and what might be our final question here, has this experience fueled or lessened your desire to wargame professionally?
So it has only added to my desire to wargame professionally. I got started in wargaming as a hobby and as sort of my side gig my freshman year of undergrad, because at my undergrad, George Washington University, we had an organization called Strategic Crisis Simulations. And the point was to design large-scale pall mill exercises 4 times a year on modern and or future warfare concepts for students and young professionals in the DC area to play. And I got involved writing and designing scenarios for that, and then stuck with that all through undergrad, ended up running the simulation design aspect of that my junior and senior year. And then when I came to Georgetown, I was intending to focus and do focus on cybersecurity issues and emerging technology, but I saw that Sebastian's course was being offered. And I was like, well, you know what, I have to take this. This is ultimately what I want to end up doing, in addition to my interest in cyber. And I had never designed a board game before. I had only designed games where, you know, it's people interacting that are driving things, not dice or cards. And what this experience, I feel, gave me was sort of the rounding out of, okay, now I know how to do all of these different aspects of game design. And I'm by no means an expert, but it certainly made me more aware of the various opportunities in the field and really made me want to dedicate myself to a career in this, although I know that I will have to supplement, most likely, my interest in wargaming with my interest in other areas and analytical skills.
And Caitlyn, with that said, I was also planning to put the link to your recent article about your sort of journey into the wargaming community and throughout the past few years, kind of that path. If you want to speak at all to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote an article that was published in PaxSims about a week and a half ago about how I got my start in wargaming, and what I see as good experiences for young wargamers to have, and also where the wargaming community writ large can do more to make sure that people who are interested and are just getting their start have pathways to identify organizations and opportunities that would be good for them. And a big inspiration for that was my experience in this course and my continued work with Goose, because I've always wanted to pursue this career, but I had absolutely no idea how to go about it. And after I graduated from undergrad, I had kind of assumed that my interest in wargaming would be limited to me going to exercises in the DC area that were open to the public and playing board games with my friends on the weekend. And what I learned from this course was that there are all of these people out there to connect to. There are all of these people who write on wargaming. That's one of the other benefits of the course, is it really gives you a foundation of wargaming literature and, you know, foundational text to read in conjunction with then designing something based on the ideas and sort of rules of the road from people who have been doing this for decades. And I think that what I've tried to do in my article is sort of outline how I got to where I am, in the hopes that that will help somebody else who's interested also identify how to get where they want to be.
All right, excellent. I think that's a perfect conclusion. And if you have any final words you want to add?
I just want to thank everybody who came out to listen to us chat. When we originally designed this game, we were thinking, oh, you know, Byzantine Roman history, that's a really niche topic. And will people really be interested in that? But I'm really excited to see that people have been interested in it, and I hope that this was enjoyable for all of you. Thank you for taking the time to hang out with us on a Tuesday night, and stay safe and stay healthy.
I would also just add, as we conclude here, obviously thanking everybody for your participation, as well as Caitlyn and Nikolai for an incredibly interesting presentation. I personally have had the opportunity to play Reconquering Rome and really enjoyed it. I felt that it's a game that, besides just being enjoyable, is one with extremely thought out game mechanics, really rooted in sort of that historical justification, the historical abstractions. And as far as the educational value, as somebody that has very little knowledge of the Gothic Wars in this whole period, I found myself taking away a lot from the game. So I just want to reiterate how much I enjoyed the game. And I think how good of a job you guys did.
Thanks.
So
I'm glad to hear you liked it.
so yeah, with that, again, thank you everybody for attending, as well as providing questions to fuel this discussion. I just put some links to all of our social media, our YouTube channel, which will have this webinar posted on our website, which will have future events, our Twitter page, as well as the link to Caitlyn's article, which she just discussed. So with that, Caitlyn, unless you have any final words, good evening to everybody, and hopefully we see you at a future event.